formulation of IDIC for your very warm, welcoming remarks. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are thrilled to transition and jump into our discussion with the theme Innovate to Elevate, how human capital and technology fuel Indonesia's 2045 vision. And will be joining us our two distinguished experts. We have Professor Paul Michael Romer as the Director of Boston College's Center for the Economics of Ideas and co-recipient of the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. And Professor Romer will discuss the endogenous growth theory, policy frameworks, and social implications amidst the digital era, a global perspective. His insights will provide a comprehensive view of the theoretical and practical aspects of economic growth in the digital era. And also we would have Professor Iwan Jaya Aziz as Professor of Emerging Markets at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management, Cornell University. As Professor Aziz will explore unlocking growth potential through human capital and technology, pathways to achieving the Golden Indonesia 2045 vision. And his focus will be on how Indonesia can leverage human capital and technology to realize its ambitious goals. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our speakers, Professor Paul Michael Romer and Professor Iwan Jaya Aziz.
Good afternoon. Thank you to everyone who was involved in inviting me back to Indonesia. It's been a pleasure to get an update about developments in the economy here, and especially about Nusantara, because as I'll explain, new cities are something that I'm particularly interested in. So let me try and summarize very briefly how we now think about economic growth. The driving force is a new idea. Think of it as instructions for doing something that gets taught to people who then do that thing, but they do it more productively than they did before they learned the new idea. I'll give you an example. If you're a carpenter or a surveyor and you need a right angle, a 90-degree angle, in the past there were different ways to do it, but then someone discovers if you measure out a triangle with sides of 3, 4, and 5, or 3, 4, 5 for the triangle, that will give you a perfect right angle. This is known as the Pythagorean theorem, of course. So that's an idea that can make it easier for someone to construct a right angle, which is something which we do in construction quite frequently. But that doesn't generate economic output. It doesn't generate value, new buildings, new roads, new fences, until some person learns that idea, learns how to use it, and then goes out and starts building roads or buildings or fences. So we want to think about both what leads to the production of the new ideas, and then what leads to what we call the human capital, which is a better informed person who's learned a new way to do something, who's learned the new idea. So let's talk about the transition from an available pool of ideas to a number of people who learn the new ideas and become more productive. And let's think about the practical challenge of trying to raise the rate of growth, of GDP growth, by, say, 3 percentage points, from 5% here in Indonesia to 8%. The basic message is that it's possible to do this, but it is very difficult. And so I want to give you a sense for how difficult it is. First, let's imagine that the school system starts next year producing graduates who are twice as productive because of all the ideas that they've learned in school than the graduates in the past. That would be a huge improvement in a school system, and it's hard to improve a school system. But imagine the new graduates were twice as effective as workers when they start work. If people work for about 50 years, the new entrants each year into the workforce are about 2% of the workforce. So it would take 50 years to get to the point where you've doubled the productivity of the workforce. So to double output, that means that you're going to get about a 2 percentage point increase per year to get a doubling, 100% increase over 50 years. So if you could have your school system produce graduates who are twice as effective when they go out in the labor market as they were last year, then you could add 2 percentage points per year to growth. Now, as I said, it'd be very difficult to have that dramatic an improvement in the school system. So there are big benefits to improvement in schooling, but they play out over long periods of time. Successful societies invest in better schools, but you have to wait decades to see the full benefits. Now let's think about another experiment. Suppose somebody is in an area where there are very few employment opportunities. So they're not employed much of the time, or not employed very effectively. And suppose suddenly it becomes possible for them to move to some place where they can get a job. Think of it as moving from a rural area to an urban area where there are firms who can use them, just their eye-hand coordination skills, to do something. Let's imagine that makes them twice as productive as well. Now, suppose we wanted to do that for 2% of the population. So we're going to double the productivity of 2%, or like say 2% of the workforce, just like I was thinking about doubling the productivity of the graduates from school. This is a little easier to imagine. We've seen rural-urban migration. We see people get jobs that are much more productive when they do that. But there's a different calculation that makes this seem a little bit daunting. The labor force in Indonesia is about 140 million, and the urbanization rate is about 60%. So there's room to have a big increase in the number of people who are living and working in urban areas, but 2% of the labor force would be like 2.8 million people per year. So how could Indonesia provide urban living space for an additional 2.8 million people per year? There's a third possible way that the skill in the labor force could increase. I hope I can explain this clearly. When someone gets a job in a well-organized, modern firm, it's not just that they go from not being very productive to being more productive when they start the job, but while they're on the job, they keep acquiring skill. We refer to this as on-the-job experience, on-the-job human capital accumulation. And we see this in the data. Young workers, especially, when they take a formal sector job at a well-organized firm, they see big improvements in their productivity over time. So if we took 2% of the population and got them into jobs where they're learning, well, let's say they're learning 10% per year. They're becoming 10% more productive per year, which is not out of line with what we see in the data. In the beginning, that's only 2% times 10%, so 0.2 that we would add to growth. But then you add another 2% from migrating to these better quality jobs. Then it's 0.2 plus 0.2, 0.4. And the more people you can get into good jobs where they learn and become more productive workers each year, the faster the growth rate accumulates. So we had maybe 2% before, maybe another 2%, initially just 0.2%, but then each year that goes up. So the growth is up by 0.2%, then 0.4%, 0.6%. A mixture of these three effects could lead to a net increase in GDP growth of 3% per year. There's one other factor to consider. The income for workers, the payments for their human capital, are roughly 2/3 of total GDP. So these improvements in workers don't change the productivity of capital. So your GDP only goes up by 2/3 times these numbers that I'm describing. So these are possible improvements in the rate of growth, but they take time and they take big changes in an economy. My father spent his career as a politician trying to improve the educational system in the United States. It's hard to do. It's important to try. It's hard to do. Many countries have gone through this structural change from living and working in rural areas to living and working in urban areas. That can lead to a one-off increase in productivity and can lead to employment in the good jobs, which are the jobs where you keep learning while you're on the job. And that, we've seen historically, has been a very important contributor to speeding up growth. This was one of the unappreciated secrets to the success in China, was rapid urbanization, a big increase in the number of people employed in jobs like manufacturing, where they were acquiring skill and becoming better and better workers over time. I refer to this by saying that work is school. It's just like school. We know there are good schools and bad schools. Some schools improve human capital a lot, some not so much. One of the goals in society should be to make sure that people have jobs, for sure, but they have good jobs in the sense that they're acquiring skill every time they go to the work site. So I don't think that's me. No? Okay. This is just a kind of in a way, a side digression that is that I want to affirm how valuable it is for Indonesia to be experimenting with building a new city. And this is the kind of thing that China did with their special economic zones. It's something that very few other countries have done. I hope that here in Indonesia, you'll take this experiment seriously and you'll keep experimenting. Many new cities are designed to attract people who are already well educated and high income. What most countries need are actually cities that can accept people who are getting their first formal sector job. This is what China was good at, was building cities that were affordable, where people could move in from rural areas and get their first job. So I don't know if New Centora will serve that function, but if it doesn't, think about trying again. Now, I asked them to put up some slides. What I wanted to do here was just show you New York City, when it started around in the 1800s, was one of the most successful cities in history because it let people with very little skill move there. They could afford to live there. They could get jobs in occupations like garment assembly and get on this ladder of progress that raised incomes for families over time. If you ask, how did New York City go from being a tiny little village into the modern city that it is, they had a very simple strategy. The city was built at the level of the kind of the black area down below, they just put some stakes in the ground and said, as more people come, this is where the roads will be. And in staking out those roads, they set aside like 30 meters of width for the avenues in New York, 20 meters for the streets, the cross streets. And this was all just farmland and pastures. But they said, don't build here because this is where Fifth Avenue will come eventually. And thereby, they created this public space, the white spaces between the triangles here, which is the framework for connectivity. Every pipe, every wire, every vehicle that would connect people or move packages, move things around, would travel on that grid. And because it was a generous grid, it could facilitate all the interactions that make a city effective at giving people jobs, jobs where they learn, jobs where growth happens. What's striking about this is that it suggests there's a very important role for the government in the beginning. Stake out and preserve the public space, because that will be the basis for connectivity. But beyond that, it's actually a remarkably simple way to develop a city. If you ask, the plan that put stakes in the ground and said, here's where the streets will be eventually, was in 1811. They planned for a 30-meter wide Fifth Avenue. They didn't even know what a bicycle was in 1811. But they said, well, they'll use these streets to some good effect. We just don't know what it is. But the reason New York can support so many people without horrendous congestion is because there's a lot of public space. And over time, we change it to bike lanes or bus lanes, or cars use it, sidewalks, we use it for pedestrians. Governments will adjust how they use it, but you've got to have the public space. But beyond that, everything else just came later. The water system, that didn't come for decades. A public sewer system, paving the roads. They had buildings built in many of these private lots, the orange squares, before anybody had even paved the roads. So all of that can come later, as long as you protect the public space that will connect people and then make the city as productive as it can be. So I hope you'll think about here in Indonesia, if you go from 60% to 80% urbanization, you're going to need urban space for another 50 million people. And where are those 50 million people going to go? You could expand the existing cities, but that gets harder and harder, especially if you don't have much public space in the core of the city. The public space here ends up being about 30% of the land. It takes a lot of public space to make a connected city. So you've got a city which doesn't start with much. If you try and build it up and add more and more people, it's very hard to keep it working effectively. But you could consider the possibility of just staking out space for 10 million people someplace else in Indonesia and say, we don't know how quickly people will move there, but we'll see. It took about 100 years to build out all of New York City. About 100 years to go from conditions like Bangladesh, where people were dying in sweatshops in the early 1900s, to the early 20th century, where people were really on the cutting edge of the modern world. But it might be valuable for somebody thinking ahead like that here in Indonesia to do the same thing. Pick 1 or 2 or 3 places and stake out the positions where you say, no matter what else happens, nobody's going to build here because this is the public space that will connect people. Other than that, we'll just see. If enough people come, we'll put in a water system, we'll put in the sewer system. So think about creating urban space. I'd give one more pitch for this idea. The demand for urban floor space is going to grow not just because more people move into cities, it's going to grow because people in cities get richer. they will want more space in their apartments as they become richer. They'll want to spend more. So the total demand for urban floor space will grow at about the rate of growth of urban income, which could be, 5, 6, 7, 8% per year. If you've got that willingness to pay, that kind of increase in willingness to pay and no increase in supply, prices are going to go through the roof. And young people are going to be priced out. And you won't have a chance for somebody who's going to get their first formal sector job to move into the city and get that job and start learning on the job because it's too expensive to go there. So providing increases in the supply of urban floor space is an urgent challenge in every country in the world. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have both talked about trying to increase the supply of housing in the United States because prices have gotten so high. I doubt that they'll do anything very bold, but I hope here you'll have a good experience with New Centura. I hope I'm saying that right. But then you'll go beyond and say, okay, what are the next 2 or 3 things like this that we can do that will change what this nation is like in 100 years? Now, this is the part of economic growth I think we don't think enough about. It's good to improve the quality of schools. It's very good to improve the health of children and stop problems like stunting. But it's also very important to let people get jobs in the modern sector, get jobs where they keep earning. That involves urbanization, and urbanization involves a government that does a minimal level of planning so that you end up with a city where you get the benefit of all of the connections. Now, the part that gets a little bit more attention is what can the government do about the new ideas? So not just teaching people how to use the Pythagorean theorem, how do we get the government to come up with new things like the Pythagorean theorem? Some of this is straightforward. We can provide subsidies for the educational system, for the research system, for professors and so forth. Let me try and suggest a couple of additional things to think about. First, there are some ideas that are bad. There was a class of chemicals called CFCs that turned out to be destroying the ozone layer on Earth. And the chemical companies were making money selling those. Government said, no, you can't sell them anymore because we don't want to destroy the planet. So governments have to have a regulatory capacity to say, if it's a bad idea, it's going to do harm on balance, we're not going to let it happen. So even though it's kind of trendy to say, oh, we want to get rid of regulation, you do want regulation to stop the bad ideas. You have to have that. One form of regulation that's actually been very successful in starting in the United States was regulation of flight safety. And it had an interesting structure. You have an aviation agency called the FAA, but you have a separate group called the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. Many countries have copied this framework. The FAA is a traditional regulator. It tells you if the plane is safe to fly, if your airline is operating planes safely. The NTSB has a very different role. They don't set regulations. Their job is only to establish the facts. Every time there's an accident, they go in and establish what the facts are. And the facts sometimes make the airlines look bad. They sometimes make the FAA look bad. Sometimes they both look bad. But the NTSB's job is not to worry about who's going to look bad. They're not protecting any other agency. They're committed to just finding out what the facts are. If we know what the facts are, then we can improve and make changes and make the system safer. And that form of regulation has created the marvel of modern air transport, which is astonishingly safe and astonishingly effective at getting us connected all over the world. So don't believe this nonsense about, regulation is the problem. We wouldn't have the kind of benefits from air travel that we have now if we didn't have that regulation. I'll come back and say something more about this at the end. But for now, just remember that a critical part of making the whole system go is knowing facts that are true. And every part of the regulatory system needs that. Now, what could you do now if you want to be part of the modern digital economy, a bigger part of the modern digital economy? One of the things I think that any country could do right now is invest more in the development of open source software. Software which is given away for free, not sold by for-profit companies. You could reward professors for writing it at universities, or university labs for developing it, students at universities. Many critical parts of our entire digital ecosystem right now are open source software. Most open source comes from the United States, some still from Europe, very little from the developing world. But open source would not only give you a way to influence the infrastructure that everybody uses, and a way to train your faculty, your young people, the new workers of the future on software development, but it's a way to determine what kind of options you'll have as well. But let's take a particular issue like cybersecurity. If I could have the next slide, please. Oh, one more. That's just another view of the map. I'll make these available, or they can make them available. There's a website where you can find this link. Notice what the name is here, the Cyber Safety Review Board. Now, wait a minute, doesn't that sound like the National Transportation Safety Board? This is a new agency which was created in the US government to go in and look every time there's a cyber accident instead of a transportation accident and say, what are the facts here? They don't make regulations. They don't say what has to change. But instead of letting these for-profit firms hire a PR firm to come and then make up some story about what happened, they go in and they see what happened. This one, is there anybody from Microsoft here? Okay. This is going to hurt if you're from Microsoft. This was a review of an incident from summer of 2023 where the Chinese government was able to read, or at least the people who were probably working for the Chinese government who broke in, were able to read every single email message that was served up by Outlook or Exchange online. Every email account managed online by Microsoft. It was an astonishingly serious breach. And then the report looked to try and see how could this possibly have happened. And what we then see was a cascade of mistakes, one after another, that multiple people had to just drop the ball to lead to such a horrible security breach. I'm saying this not just to underline the point I made before about it's good to have a government agency and a regulatory agency that can look and see what went wrong, but I want to also suggest that there are critical functions like security that we can't count on the private market system to provide. We just can't. They've failed, these firms have failed over and over again so badly, but better security is the kind of thing that open source providers, rather than these for-profit, proprietary, secretive providers, better security is the kind of thing that open source providers could offer. So investing in open source could both produce ideas for the world about how to do things more safely, but could also help you protect yourselves from the cyber threats, which are going to be, I think, an ever bigger part of our lives going forward. To make cities work, we had to solve two problems. We had to make sure you didn't get sick when you went to a city, and so we had to have public water, public sewage, the basics of public health. And then we had to make sure that you weren't a victim of crime, so we had to have policing to keep cities safe. We don't have the same kind of health issues online, but we have very serious issues about criminal activity now online, and they're getting worse And you cannot count on the private sector to solve these. But investments in something like open source, an open source community is a way to get those benefits for your nation and even contribute to the world's ability to manage these problems. I thought we might try and do one of those surveys. Can we have the next slide? I don't know if anybody, do people have the ability to provide these surveys? Let's skip the survey. Just go on. I'll show you the thing. Oh, and now I'm confused about my order, the order of things. Just hang on. Let me just give you the point I was trying to make. There is a new development in cybersecurity called passcodes. Does anybody have a passcode and have tried it? Scroll ahead one or two, a couple more slides. Just keep going. Keep going. No, I'm totally confused. I thought I had pictures. I thought I had pictures of passcodes. So hold off on that. But passcodes are an example of something which could replace passwords that we're used to. They could be much better in terms of security, but they pose a really serious risk that they're going to further entrench the power of a few companies that are already too powerful. Google, Apple, mainly, Microsoft as well, all three of them, will probably use a transition to passcodes to have even more control over your life and make it even harder for you to switch to some other provider, use some other kind of service. If we relied on open source software to deal with security, we wouldn't have to be serfs trapped by a few feudal companies to get better security. So we need to develop this open source world, and I think it's also a very good way for a country to invest in its talented digital workforce. Let me just suggest what could be important. Maybe innovations in operating systems. Absolutely innovation in the browser. The browser has an enormous influence over what you do every day, and Google has way too much control over it. But also things like ID. How do you prove who you are online? So the provision of ID services. This is a very important task which is coming, where open source and governments will do better than the private sector. Let me just say as an aside, I think that AI is overhyped. So it will be useful for some things. I think it will not be as influential as many people think. So understand that there's some uncertainty here, and don't bet too heavily on some dramatic transformation, because it may not happen. I've tried, when I write code a lot, I've tried using AI to help me write code. I think it's way overhyped. Okay, so now let me go back to the, oh, there they found it. Okay, this is a login you might see for Google on the right, where it says use a saved passkey for Google, but then the only way to do it is to have something with iCloud, which is what Apple controls. This is something similar from GitHub, which is owned now by Microsoft, sign in with a passkey. This is coming. It could offer huge security benefits and a huge entrenchment of existing monopolies. And if I were trying to work on behalf of the people of Indonesia, I would not want to make them serfs to these companies. Let me try and close, and then we'll move on to the discussion. If you could go back then to that graph about the jobs. The thing that many people think, at least in the United States, and I thought maybe some people would think here, is that Republicans are better for creating jobs or the economy or growth. This is the actual data on job creation since the end of the Cold War. Democratic presidential administrations, about 50 million jobs. Republican administrations, net 1 million jobs. This is the actual data on the difference between these two parties. And what's troubling is that the perceptions that many voters have are just at variance with the facts. They think Republicans are better at managing the economy. The Republicans just objectively have gone off the rails. They make proposals now which are just like deregulate and cut taxes, which turn out to be systematically harmful and to cause crises and recessions. And the Democrats have just followed sort of standard textbook economics and things work out okay. But most voters don't seem to know this simple fact. If you go to the next slide, it wasn't quite so bad under previous administrations. Like I voted for Ronald Reagan. I'm not embarrassed to admit that. You know, there was some sense in the Reagan policies, but something's really gone wrong with the Republican policies in the United States. This is all from a recent Washington Post article that came up because Bill Clinton talked about these facts at the Democratic National Convention. There's one more slide which just has a quote from the news article, if you can show the next one, which is that if you say, okay, well, let's not look at like COVID and penalize Trump for COVID or, you know, the first year. Let's look at the middle 2 years for Trump and the middle 2 years for Biden. And it was 4.3 million jobs for Trump versus 7.5 for Biden. So the point is not just there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans, but that most people do not actually know the facts about the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. So then let me go back and link that to what I said about the NTSB. You can't make good decisions if you don't know the facts. And there's something going systematically wrong with our systems, our culture's abilities to stay in touch with the facts. And this, I think, also traces back to the business models and incentives of some of these dominant firms and the digital media ecosystems that they've created. So if you care about facts, you want to worry about why the connection between what people believe and the facts is getting systemically worse over time. Now, I want to close with just one last story, which is a little bit more optimistic than this. Well, let me just bring this home here. You do not have to buy into the systems that are dominant in the United States. For example, I have said that the ad-based revenue model for digital services is toxic. It's not the market. It's not that I pay for what I get. Somebody else pays Google a bribe to show me something that I didn't want when I search. I think advertising is a terrible model. These firms are too powerful to change this in the United States. You could decide here in Indonesia, we're going to put a very heavy tax on every dollar of advertising revenue collected by a firm that provides digital services to the citizens of Indonesia. Somebody wants to sell a subscription, we don't have to tax that. But we're going to get away from this bad perversion of the market that's all based on advertising and distortion and tracking and spying and misleading people. Let's go back to the market the way it's supposed to work. You could decide to do this. You don't have to have a digital services market that's like the market in the United States. And I would much rather live in a country where you just put an enormously high tax on advertising and try to get us back to the model where people pay to get services. But the point is the choice is yours. Okay, the last point. In the lead up to the Beijing Olympics, a few people in China realized that their aviation fatality rate was 10 times the fatality rate in the United States. And they were worried about plane crash, which would embarrass them before the Beijing Olympics. So they quietly reached out to the FAA and the NTSB in the United States. And then those two regulators who knew how to set up a safe system of regulation for flights took what they knew and taught it to the Chinese. They transferred the whole system to China. And Boeing actually helped train the pilots in China as well to use, to abide by this new system. And the fatality rate in China went down by a factor of 10. It was all done quietly because it, you didn't want to seem, condescending or imperialistic or whatever bad word you want to use about it. But it was something that the U.S. had figured out how to do. And the Chinese decided they wanted to do it too, to get those same benefits. This is the potential from ideas that we can share. The United States didn't lose anything by making flights in China safer. It's not like they took some timber that we wanted to have or some minerals or something. In this economy of ideas, we can actually share things and all be better off. And so if you think about the terrible kind of conflicts we are in now about trying to fight over pieces of land and fight over the semiconductor business, we could go back to that kind of quiet cooperation where we're sharing ideas and we're all better off. And that's the way we need to try and steer our whole system. And it's the thing that should guide us as we move into the rest of this century, building out an economy based on ideas. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank Purbaya and the leadership of the IDIC for inviting me again in a similar forum like last year. Innovate to elevate. I think the theme cannot be sort of been argued that is this the one that is needed by most of the emerging markets and developing countries? And unanimously the answer is yes. The question is really, what are the problems, the issues, and the obstacles so that we understand them in such that we can figure out about what kind of design of policies that one can sort of propose. So in that context, let me bring the issues of that technology and productivity into the case of Indonesia. And I do really hope during the Q&A session later on, some of you can give some inputs, whether or not what I'm observing, which is a bit concerning, is really not to be concerned too much, okay? Because I'm wearing two hats here. IDIC asking me to give few talks, but also later on, they asked me to conduct the Q&A and the discussion with Paul, who just gave excellent speech about the role of the urbanization behind which there's a potential of technology improvement through ideas, exchange of ideas for people who live in the urban area. So let me begin with the structure of the Indonesian economy. And nothing is unusual if you look at the trend, the declining share of agriculture sector, the increasing share of the services sector. But there are two things that is inviting questions here. Number one is, what happened with the manufacturing sector share? Because it increased for a while, but then it started to decline. And the decline was so notable after early 2000. So that was really on the output side. But if you look at on the labor side, which is the bottom part of the chart, the employment side, again, it's declining in the agriculture sector, increasing in the manufacturing sector, even though in terms of the size it's much smaller than the other two sectors. But notice what happened with the employment in the services sector. It's not only increasing, but increasing very rapidly. Indeed, this is what is going on. Most of the labor force has been moving towards that particular sector. Now, nothing is wrong with that. Any economic textbook will tell you that any structural transformation will be featured by the declining of the agriculture, the increasing of the manufacturing and the services sector. But behind that kind of premise, there is an implicit assumption. The reason why moving from agriculture to manufacturing and services is because the productivity is increasing in those two sectors. This is what is mind-boggling in the case of Indonesia, because a lot of workers moving towards services sector, but the productivity is low and declining. Now, we talk a lot, I'm sure in the other session, talk a lot about the role of technology, including AI and so forth. So theoretically, when you have that kind of knowledge, that kind of technology, theoretically it should boost your productivity. But why the trend of productivity? I'm talking about the growth. I'm not talking about the level, but the growth of productivity has been declining. Next slide. So if you look at the bar chart, so the light color there, if you draw the trend line, it's declining. That's the growth of labor productivity. So what happened? Where is the role of technology, knowledge, spillover, and things like that? Well, if you pay close attention on the results of the decomposition of that trend, pay attention on the green color. Let me translate to you in a simple word. What is that green color represent? It represents the trend of to what extent workers are moving to the fast-growing productivity sector. Clearly in this chart, that green line all the way is below the zero line, which means negative. By the way, this is an average case. I'm sure there are 1, 2, 3 sectors in which the workers are moving to fast-growing productivity sectors. But overall, nationwide, on average, it's not happening. So that explains mostly why the trend of labor productivity has been declining. Despite all this technology, all this AI, all this hype about the role of the knowledge-intensive industries and so forth. Does it mean that all those are not well used or utilized? No, that's not the story. The story is dualism. So if you look at the next chart, if you look at the services sector, the productivity, as I said earlier, has been low and declining. Does it mean that there is no improvement in the services industries like IT, banking sector, and all those transportation sector? Of course there are. But the number in terms of the people who are involved in those activities are relatively low. So majority of the services sectors are not working in those particular modern sectors. Instead, they're mostly working in the low productive services sectors. Example being trade. We know there are 2 types of trade, wholesale trade and retail trade. Majority of the employment, increased employment, because we have a lot of labor force, so increase of the employment are moving to the retail trade. These are the sectors that suffer from low productivity, and not only low, the growth of that low productivity has been negative. This is very concerning. The challenge is, of course, how do we improve the productivity of those bulk of the employment in the services sector? Now, colleague of ours, Professor Danny Roderick from Harvard University, he kept talking about the role of manufacturing sector as a driver of the innovation, technology, and so forth. But you saw from the first chart that the share of manufacturing in Indonesia has been declining. What is growing on? What is instead rapidly growing? It's services sector. So I'm willing to take the risk by stating the following. We need to find technology, innovation, anything that you can think of to increase the productivity in the services sector. Simply because the bulk of the labor, the bulk of the workers are in this sector, and it continues to increase. That is really the challenge in terms of how to increase the productivity, because, you know, when people ask about growth, everybody talk about the growth rate, 5%, and then maybe the new government is aiming at 8%. Why don't we talk about the sustainability of the growth? And the moment you talk about sustainability of the growth, you're talking about productivity. You can grow 8% for 1-2 years, but after that, you drop the growth. But if you maintain the growth of productivity, you will be able to sustain relatively high growth. So the story here is really the story of productivity. When we talk about technology, when we talk about innovation, all are aiming at one and only one, and that is improve in the productivity. But when you have this dualism, by the way, the dualism is not only happening in services, but also in manufacturing sector. Why the small number of manufacturing and services are doing extremely well in terms of productivity? Well, because of the globalization, because of competition, they have to compete with the global companies, with the MNCs. That's why they have to be as productive as possible. Many of them started to use AI. But again, their number is relatively small. The same thing in services sector. There is a dualism. And I think the moderator, when he introduced us, mentioned about my recent book on listen and design, on SME, on the micro, small, and medium enterprise. That is the bulk of the services sector that suffer from declining growth of productivity. So that's where I can see the topic of today, which is about innovation, which lead to productivity, and yet give this dualism of productivity in the Indonesian economy. Services, I gave an example, retail trade there. The growth of the productivity way below zero line, negative. So, all in all, when we are talking about innovate to elevate, I'm sure behind that very nice rhyme, there is an implicit assumption there has to be an improvement in the productivity or efficiency, whatever you call it. Because productivity is nothing but one measure of efficiency. Paul and I was talking about, think about tourism. Young people, young Indonesian working in the tourism sector, doesn't have to be hotel, any hospitality sector. That is an area where young people can exchange ideas. And hopefully that ideas, the improved ideas, can spill over to the other young people. So maybe that is one example of the improved productivity that we can expect coming from the services sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Such an insightful, yes, sir. We're going to have a Q&A session, if I...
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Or maybe I better sit down here.
Yes, please do. Please get comfortable. Thank you very much once again for all of your expert insights. We have been talking about productivity, increasing in productivity, and also having foresight in putting stakes in potential urban areas. And so right now we would like to open the floor. If you have any questions, please do raise your hand and also mention your...
If I could, just while people are composing their
Yes, sir.
questions, let me just try and draw some of the links.
Yeah, actually, that's what the organizer asked me to conduct some sort of fireside chat between them before we go to the.
All right, go ahead. My apologies,
If
sir.
I can just kind of comment, I think one useful way to think about the problems we were pointing to is that we see evidence of an activity which has high productivity or high income for at least some people in it, but then we're not seeing the movement into that activity you'd normally expect. So we're not seeing the movement into urban life out of the rural sector that is kind of what you'd expect when productivity and income is declining in the rural sector. So there's some kind of a barrier there. The thing that worries me is the same kind of barrier in this part of the services sector that's driven by software and IT. Think about something like AI or an operating system that Windows controls. This is proprietary, and it might be generating huge income for a few people who can get access to it, but the monopoly control means that there's no way for other people to go in and take advantage of that. And the way to think about what I was saying about open source is imagine everything in the software world was like the Pythagorean theorem. Suppose it was all public. Like any smart kid, any few people who want to try and use the latest results from AI, the latest operating systems, suppose all of that were public. No barriers to entry. So there wouldn't be profits from owning ideas, but there would be things that people would do with those ideas that would provide big benefits. Another flip side of this part that I'm expressing a concern about is this growing fear amongst economists that we're seeing this monopoly control being established in these key technology sectors that will mean a very few people control incredibly valuable assets. So I think that we should go back to things like the Pythagorean theorem. We have a way to produce and give away things like the Pythagorean theorem. It's the research world. We have something comparable with open source. I think we should get away from letting these proprietary firms control and limit opportunities there. But at the same time, I also think we got to create more opportunity in cities for people to move in.
And that's where the role of government and regulators, right? Precisely, yeah. And of course, having trying to focus on that non-high-tech kind of a sector, it doesn't mean that we should not, boost or provide incentive for the high-tech sectors because they need to grow. But the key is they need to create spillover to more labor force, spillover to majority of the workers. I think that's the key here. So it's not either or. I think both has to be done. But as far as absorbing labor, absorbing workers from the agriculture sector, that's what they need to do. Now, Paul, earlier, I think what he alluded in his talk is really the importance of urbanization, because I know some people has sort of different ideas of urbanization. They see it as something negative because when they talk about urbanization, they talk about, oh, it creates a,
There's a word, whenever somebody uses the word sprawl, you
yes.
know they don't like urbanization. They want to stop it. They think it's like cancer or something.
Exactly, creating the, density, creating crime, created all kinds of problems here. But Paul indicated about the positive role of urbanization, especially in terms of ideas, because new ideas, exchange of ideas are taking place in the urban areas. And he mentioned about Indonesia so far is only about 60%. So he imagined even if we reach 80%, that should be better. And that should potentially improve the productivity of the whole countries here. Now, my, not really questions, but a statement here, and correct me if I'm wrong, that requires certain necessary condition, and that is the knowledge level of those urban residents. The reason I'm raising this is because, unfortunately, if we look at many of the education and knowledge indicators, take for example PISA. They classified into science, mathematics, and reading. We are still in a low side of the ranking here. So I was wondering, given the fact that we have that kind of a low sides of the knowledge and education level, what needs to be done? Of course, the easy answer is, okay, you have to improve that. But effort has been tried for 30 years, 40 years, but it's still stuck into that. So given that condition, how can we ensure that urbanizations will continue to be the source of the exchange of ideas and eventually the source of the knowledge development?
Well, you know, you were pointing out at lunch that I have a tendency sometimes to just skip over, like, what was that Nobel thing about anyway? You know,
that's right. I
what,
forgot
you
what
know,
that-
yeah, what, you know, what was that? The thing that I started focusing on was that economists were thinking as if what you do in an economy is work with physical objects. You extract copper ore, you refine the copper, you make copper tubing, someone on a truck moves the copper tubing from one place to another, someone installs it in a house. But it was all about like moving things, manipulating physical objects. And this is back in 1980, I was thinking, wait a minute, there's something very important that goes on besides the physical objects, it's the ideas. Somebody figures out the Pythagorean theorem or the passcode that I was alluding to, or which is a very complicated but a very clever idea for security. And it seemed to me that our economic system is much about producing ideas and distributing those ideas as it was about producing and distributing objects. We should treat them the same and give them the same level of attention. But then when you start paying attention to ideas, you realize that the systems that work for physical objects might not work for ideas. So then you have to start thinking about things like maybe there's a role for the government to subsidize science. Maybe there's a role for open source. Maybe we don't want to have an advertising model where firms can take advantage and trick people. So the policy implications have all derived from this very basic question I started asking, which was, how do we change our policies to make them fit in a world where most economic activity will be producing, sharing, absorbing ideas? Now, we also talked briefly at lunch about how even if people go into a sector which currently has low productivity, like maybe the services sector, and even if they're not very well paid, there may be a kind of a silver lining which we're not seeing in the statistics. A young person who goes and works in the, say, the hospitality sector learns teamwork, they learn skills about quality control, they learn responsibility, just they have to show up every day, they have to make sure things are working well. So they may be learning a lot from those jobs. And in some ways, I think it's worth thinking about it, that work is school. They don't get paid to go to school, but it's still good for them to go to school. And in the same way, there may be parts of the economic system that are teaching people new things, and then the productivity numbers are misleading because they're not capturing the gains in skill for the workers. this is partly based on my own introspection about why I've succeeded as an adult. I think it was partly I went to school, but it was also partly that my father made me do like hard physical labor in the summers. I did construction work, and I did stuff that was dangerous with a chainsaw when I look back on it. But I think we probably underestimate the acquisition of skill that can come from that. Now, to link it to what you were saying just a second ago, there's a book I recommend called Factory Girls. I've forgotten the name of the author, but Factory Girls is the story of some young women from rural China who then moved into, it must have been Shenzhen, I'm not sure, it probably was Shenzhen, very early in opening up in China. And they were working in things like toy manufacturing or textiles, very kind of low level, what we call like sweatshop jobs. But what you see when she talks to these young women is the amazing amount they're learning in the city. They're learning about mobile phones, and they're learning about, dating, and they're learning about this whole modern world that they couldn't see when they were in the rural areas. So it helps you get a sense for the reality that just as work is school, living in a city is school. You just get drenched in, immersed in new ideas.
What would you recommend in terms of measuring those learning components?
I think what would be good is to actually track individuals over time. Like track someone like me, where I was paid very poorly by my father, and I built barbed wire fences and cut wood with a chainsaw. But track how my performance was and compare me to somebody they didn't have that kind of a job, or track what happens because you read about the Factory Girls is very helpful for this, because they start out in really horrible jobs none of us would want to stay in, but then they move, they learn, they very quickly figure out how to survive in this modern world and get more like service sector jobs. So if we had longitudinal data where we track what happens to individuals over time, I think what we would see is there are some circumstances that lead to rapid wage growth. They don't lead to high wages at first, but they lead to rapid growth. There are other things where, even though the wages might have been a little higher at first, they're stagnant. And that's the way I would try and tease out these effects, because we don't measure the skill that they acquire. The only thing we know is that if they are acquiring skill, they'll be paid better in the future.
Thank you. I'm not sure about this time constraint. Is it including the Q&A with the public?
I don't think so, sir. It's just for the fireside chat. Yeah, no,
okay.
it's not.
In
Yes,
that
go
case,
ahead.
let's open the session for the Q&A. Any question, any comment? Yes, please. Maybe far back, the gentleman on the far back. Yeah.
And are there microphones that
Yes, please.
are moving around?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I think something's coming.
Thank you so much. I'm Krishna. I'm actually an ex-New Yorker as well as Cornellian, so happy to see you both.
Can you speak closer to the microphone?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was saying my name is Krishna. I used to be in New York as well, and I was a Cornellian. So I can sort of like second the point about how New York City is actually a good example of like a positive urbanism in terms of exchange of ideas. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to sort of bundle together. I think first of all is for Paul. So what do you think about the current discussion about unbundling big tech, particularly the Google case? And second is that what do you think about blockchain and decentralized ledger technology, right? Since you talk about open source and since you talk about decentralizing, sort of like this institutions. And I think for Pa Iwan, so you mentioned about sort of like the problem with the productivity rate, right? Like what will be your hypothesis now, right, to sort of improve that? And how do you think sort of like a probable innovation that could help with that? Do you currently have a hypothesis for that? Thank you so much.
Let me go first. full disclosure, my son works at Google. I don't think, I also worked on the remedy phase of the Microsoft case, where I was the official spokesman for splitting Microsoft into the operating system company and then the Office company. The thing that happened was the judges who were being asked to tear this company apart didn't have the courage to do it. And in a case that was really very clear about the monopoly power. So I'm very pessimistic about any kind of effective structural remedy that would break Google apart. It just won't happen in our system. And unfortunately, the judiciary has gotten so captured by a kind of a free market mindset that it's even less likely. So look, if something's going to save most people on Earth from the total control that Google can now exert over the browser, it's going to come from countries like Indonesia who say, we're going to make sure that there's a way to use a browser in this country which isn't under Google's control. You know, Firefox is seemingly independent of Google, but Google provides all the money for Firefox, so it's really just kind of a fraud. But like government in Indonesia could take Firefox, because it's open source. You could take its code. You could get people here starting to improve it, build your own Indonesian version, and just make it a reality that, at least in this country, you don't have to be the serfs who are controlled by the feudal lord of Google. So I'm really hopeful, and it could be the EU will do some of this, but I don't see why it wouldn't make sense for the people of countries like Indonesia to say, we want this to be open. We want all these ideas to be out there. If you read how Google will just like stifle and kill some company like Yelp that's trying to compete with some service that Google offers, that there's no chance if Google controls the browser. But it wouldn't have to be that Google controls the browser here if it were kind of pure open source. And then services like Yelp you could have free entry of bright young people creating new services. So I'm instead of the whole world thinking the United States is going to take the lead on antitrust, the people in the United States are going to pray for the rest of the world to do something about these companies. I forgot what your second question was, but
on blockchain and decentralized ledger technology.
You just have to break these pieces apart. Blockchain is a way to record on a lot of different servers some information. So it's a way to make sure that that information will be preserved indefinitely. That's okay, it's not so special. Cyber currencies are basically a way to evade productive regulation. So cyber currency is a way for criminals to conduct transactions that we've made it hard for them to conduct within our regulated financial institutions. So I don't think we should allow cyber currencies to exist. I think they're useless. They're worse than useless. They're counterproductive. We have a ransomware business now that's all based on being able to do transactions with cyber currency. The one other piece in the middle there's like the consensus mechanism with distributed storage that gives you a public record. You got the cyber currency itself. There's something called a cryptographic signature, which is actually used to transact on something like like Bitcoin. These cryptographic signatures are very powerful tools. That's what's behind that thing that I was calling a passcode, and could make your logins much safer. But what's at stake right now is the power of that cryptography could either be controlled by Microsoft, Google, and Apple, or it could be controlled by us. And I want it to be controlled by us.
Thank you. Now, let me try to answer the questions here. Depending on which type of businesses or establishment that we're talking about, but my focus is on MSME, simply because 98% are micro. Now, the honest answer, I don't know. And that is the reasons why I go to the field. Because I don't know. If I don't know what is behind the wall, I go behind the wall. And that's exactly what I did. I tried to interview all the MSME from all over the country. And here is their answer. What we need, of course, they need many things. They need infrastructure, they need financing, they need training and so on. But one thing that they keep consistently mentioning is network. Networking, that's what they need. Take, for example, the pandemic. Both the big guys and the small guys was hit tremendously during the pandemic. But who recovered fast? It's the medium and the big guys. Why? Are they more smarter? Are they, more technology savvy and, more advanced? Maybe true, but the key is really networking. If you're a big guys, you know who are the regulators, you can contact them. You know the bankers, you can contact them about the financing. You know the marketing and so forth. But when you are small guy, you don't know anybody. There is no way, they don't even know how to contact, let alone to call. How to contact, they don't know. So that's why their answers are almost unanimous from Aceh to Papua, networking. I mean, unfortunately, the time is up here, so I cannot elaborate further, but if I may, I think this is commercial break now, right? So if I may, you can read my book, Listen and Design. This is